Thank you very much for the invitation. I guess I'll speak for a dozen minutes about the questions that you asked. I'm thrilled to talk about my discipline and where it's going, which is the first question. So my discipline is phonology. That is, I try to explain how humans organize speech sounds. In practice, this means that I'm always on the lookout for interesting sound patterns that are out there. And when I stumble on a cool sound pattern, a phonological phenomenon, I first try to understand how it works on its own. And then I try to show that it arises from a particular interaction of factors that aren't specific to that phenomenon at hand. My goal is to take something that is a sound puzzle at first. It looks puzzling at first, and to show that it's actually boring, believe it or not, because the whole idea is to transfer my own personal excitement for this specific phenomenon to its unification with other larger phenomena. My framing here owes to a recent talk by MIT's David Pozetsky. What we hope not to have to say about P is that it is sui generis. We hope to show that P is actually boring. And as a result of this process, my confidence and my interest in the theory grows. So I can give a couple of concrete examples to illustrate this process. One of the local indigenous languages that I've worked on is an isolate called Tunah. It's spoken in the Rockies over here. And like most indigenous languages in that area, it has a voiceless lateral fricative, which sounds like So here's the sound puzzle. Tunah speakers use this hla sound whenever they borrow French words or English words that happen to have L sounds or R sounds. So French names like Marie and Paul are borrowed as Machli and Paul. And English names like Harry and Alice are borrowed as Achlis or Hashli. So this loanword adaptation pattern of sounds is surprising at first because French sounds like R and English sounds like L or R don't sound anything like phonetically, at least. But this kind of makes sense in phonology because the phonological class, which phonologists call liquid, subsumes R-type sounds and L-type sounds. And hl happens to be the only L-type sound in Tunah, therefore it's a liquid. And so the adaptation of liquids of all sorts to hl is expected, you could even, or even boring, you could say. So what we've done in this case is we've taken a surprising phenomenon, a surprising loanword adaptation of sounds, and we've transferred that interest to phonological theory. And in the process, we've strengthened our confidence in the theory, for instance, the notion of a phonological class of liquids. So that's a first example. The next example is a sound pattern that I can thank my son for. This is my youngest who, between the ages of 3.5 and 4, went through a stage of pronouncing a name like Karina as Akrina, Dakrina, Krakrina, Makrina. It's a truly bizarre pattern, but it actually makes sense in terms of the acquisition of phonology. So the fact is, children go through a stage of stuffing speech sounds into chunks of prosody, syllables, and metrical feet, which are chunks of prosody that consist of 1 or 2 syllables. And so, for instance, you might find that banana is squished into bana, or giraffe is squished into draff, 1 syllable. Karina is squished into the foot, krina, right? Now, some children, including my son, then go through a next stage of refitting or restoring that missing syllable while still continuing to stuff all the speech sounds into a metrical foot. So this means that you have a restored syllable, which is minimally restored with a schwa vowel, like so Karina being pronounced Akrina. And then that syllable is very syllabified with basic consonants like D. So Karina becomes Dakrina, or M is another basic sound. So Karina could be pronounced as Makrina, or else the syllable can be filled by copying the consonants at the beginning of the foot. So you get Krakrina. The latter is a very interesting process that may well be universal, called reduplication. So this baffling process or pattern that my son went through during his phonological development, and one that you find in the phonological development of other children too, tells us something interesting about, well, the strength of the theory, because these phonological constructs like syllables and feet play a key role in explaining what's happening, and they're crucial in explaining how phonology grows in children. And the ability of phonological theory to handle rather extreme phenomena like this without positing any new structures or processes that are all familiar things out there is just really speaks to the strength of the theory. Okay? So the second question that I've been asked is, what is my research program? Well, my long-standing interest, overriding interest, has been in glottal width. Some of my earliest publications in Phonology, the journal, or the Canadian Journal of Linguistics, had to do with the two settings, which are spread glottis and constricted glottis. I've documented how these features work in a variety of indigenous languages, Wakashan languages, Salishan languages, Siouan languages, Dene Athabaskan languages, quite a few. A PhD student of mine that I co-supervised with Betsy Ritter recently, his name is Joey Winsler, worked on the use of spread glottis at the ends of phonological phrases in Blackfoot, which is a local important indigenous language. One of my current PhD students, this is Brett Nelson, is documenting the use of and acquisition of spread glottis and constricted glottis in Kaqchikel, which is a Mayan language. Another PhD student is Mohammed Al-Samani, whose research I'm co-supervising with Steve Winters, has documented the loss of spread glottis as a phonological feature in mainland Swahili. An MA student, Marion Hodgson, whose research I'm co-supervising with Angeliki, is documenting the use of glottal width in her own heritage language, which is Plains Cree. And finally, I have done quite a bit of work myself on the use of spread glottis and constricted glottis in English. So glottal width has been a constant in my research life. The third and last question is, how do I contribute to my discipline? My discipline, as I've just said, is to contribute to phonological theory with indigenous languages. Just for instance, many theorists, such as Karen Rice at U of T, excludes the lateral fricative from the class of liquids. Well, when I suggest that the adaptation of liquids as the lateral fricative in Tunah suggests that lateral fricatives belong in the class of liquids, contra, Rice, etc. There's some urgency to this kind of work because Tunah has fewer than 24 speakers. And one of the things I enjoy is by improving our documentation of the language and understanding it better, we can better support language teachers, community activists, community organizations that are aimed at revitalizing, at restoring, reclaiming these indigenous languages. And it's been my great honor to be involved in those sorts of activities too. But I'd like to return to the first question and wrap things up, and particularly where my discipline is going. One general idea was to transfer our excitement of individual phenomena that we investigate to unify them with larger phenomena and to strengthen the theory. It's what we linguists have always done to very good effect, and it seems to drive the field forward. Now, in practice, what we find in phonology is the pendulum of explanation seems to swing back and forth between explaining things more in terms of rules and processes on the one hand, or on the other hand, more representations along the lines of phonological structure, prosodic structure, phonological features, and so on. in an ideal future, then we theorists will converge on explanatory tools that are simpler and ever better motivated. And so the domain of lab faun, where lab refers to laboratory, that is useful because it helps us theorists stay honest. But I hope that theorists retain some latitude to dream up new models to be tested. And I also hope that theorists will push back against certain trends in lab faun, such as promoting sociophonetics and quote unquote data science, big data, or big computing. You know, these sorts of things sound exciting, they sound promising, they sound empirical, but so-called data-driven science doesn't really tend to advance phonological theory from what I've read and seen. Unlike hypothesis-driven science, which is really best at eliminating bias in science, so-called data science can even generate hypotheses. You could automate hypothesis generation, but those kinds of hypotheses that are generated in data science tend to be uninteresting for phonological theory. So my hope is that human theorists retain responsibility for artfully and creatively coming up with models that are tested and replaced and improved over time. And finally, part of me hopes that there's still room for what's called naturalistic observation. You know, that tends to be more anecdote based, but I still think that anecdotes get a bad rap, where phonologists can observe an individual phenomenon and yet can learn a lot about, you know, like it could be a speech error, just a one-off thing, and yet that anecdote can be quite instructive. So there's lots of room for different ways of advancing theory. Well, I guess I'll leave it there, and appreciate the opportunity to think about all these things. So I look forward to your own thoughts, Mary and Moucher, and my other colleagues, Irene and Betsy and Angeliki and Martin and so on. Take care.